Okay, well, good morning. We're going to make a start. It's a very lovely to see everybody on this environment. This is obviously the Built Environment Day at COP28, and we have a sort of a great panel to sort of explore frankly, the opportunities and challenges associated with decarbonisation of the built environment. As an engineer, as an optimist, I always like to think about the opportunities, and our job is to overcome those challenges. The panel today, I'm going to just give a very brief overview to sort of the context in which we are operating. And we're then going to be followed by Caroline Ray from Arup, then Chris Trott from Foster and Partners, Mohammed Khalid from Johnson Controls, and then Esther Obonyo from Pennsylvania State University, and then hopefully Eugenie from the University of Pennsylvania. She's otherwise involved in another session at the moment, will be hoping to join us. And unfortunately, Ans Irfan, who was originally planning to be with us, can't actually join us this morning because one of his colleagues has been taken ill, and therefore he's having to step out and cover for them. But nevertheless, we have a great panel this morning on the built environment, and I'm going to kick off. So what I thought might be helpful, I'm just going to share some slides. Right, here we go. So I'm director of the Centre for Climate Repair at the University of Cambridge, and also director of research for Cambridge Zero. Cambridge Zero is the University of Cambridge's major climate change initiative, and it looks after and tries to help coordinate and support research across the whole of the university and with other universities and other kinds of institutions on research aimed at climate change. And the way that that works is broken into three areas. The first is what we call climate science. So there's a whole body of work that has been going on for this understanding, increasing our level of understanding of the climate and the sort of the unfolding changes in that. And then there are two other legs to this stool. The first is getting concerned about actually the changes and therefore what we might need to do and will need to do as humankind in order to adapt to that changing climate. So there's a whole piece on adaptation. And then thirdly, adaptation is not going to be sufficient. And there is this term which we might call mitigation, but it's really what do we do to try and intersect and carve a different pathway for humanity and other ecosystems to be able to sort of change the course of climate change. So those are the three legs of the stool that that Cambridge Zero is interested in supporting, and there are lots of levers which might range from technical to social sciences to finance and engagement with stakeholders, but that's how we think about the world of climate change. Now, in terms of the reason why I get excited about the built environment is as follows. First of all, if we look at just where we use energy in society, it represents a significant part of greenhouse gas emissions. So energy, our use of energy is absolutely huge in terms of our footprint on the world in terms of anthropogenic reasons for emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And within the energy sector, we find that energy use in buildings and energy use in industry, both of which are relevant for the built environment, are hugely significant. And therefore it's beholden upon us when we think about the built environment and our work in the built environment to recognize the responsibility that we have regarding our current impact on the climate. And then if we look at where things are going, there are lots of sort of future scenarios, predictions that have been made by lots of different people. And one of the references that I have used over the years is the BP Energy Outlook. The most recent one that I was able to get hold of was 2020, so it's maybe 3 years out of date now. And you might say, well, you know, the BP Energy Outlook, I know that sort of raises a few eyebrows, especially in the current context of being here at COP28. But it is a good source of data. They invest quite a lot of money and resources and therefore it's something that I go to. And this picture here, I want us to just dwell on for a little bit. So it looks at the primary energy consumption by end use sector for different scenarios. That's the rapid decarbonisation of one getting to net zero, and of course the business as usual. What I want to look at is actually the chart on the right. And under the business as usual scenario, what we find is that the sector which is growing the fastest in terms of energy consumption is indeed the built environment, buildings. And that's just energy use in buildings. This is, and if we couple that with our work of providing materials and all of the stuff associated in industry, which we then throw at the buildings to try and make a better job of buildings, the picture is even greater in terms of our responsibility. So with that, we have a huge responsibility to reduce emissions. And as I said at the beginning, you can weigh this in two different ways. It's a massive challenge, but I also say, therefore, it is a massive opportunity that we have to try and make a difference to the climate. So I'm going to now hand over to Caroline from Arup to get us started. And Caroline, I'm going to sort of bring your slides up, and therefore maybe perhaps you would be kind enough to let me know when you would like the next slide to be shown. So give me one moment whilst we just get your slides up.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much indeed, Sean. As Sean has said, my name is Caroline Ray. I am the Regional Director for a company called Arup in East Africa. Arup is a global sustainable development consultancy, and I've been living and working in Africa for the last 15, 16 years, and very much committed to seeing how we address this question of decarbonising the built environment within Africa, when at the same time Africa's population is growing. Next slide, please. I think that's great. Thank you. I think there might be a little delay here from Nairobi. Africa's population is growing. So across the continent at the moment, the population is 1.4 billion, and it's forecast to grow by more than 1 billion further by 2050. So these years in which are critical for climate change mitigation, it's when Africa's population is still almost doubling in size. And we're also seeing a growth in that urban population, people moving from rural areas to find jobs in cities. We already have several mega cities across the continent, in the north, in the west, in the east, and growing in the south. And we have a gradual transition of people from rural areas to urban, plus as well that urban population growth, just with families now settling in urban areas, having children, and those children remaining as urban sort of city dwellers. So it is anticipated that by 2035, half of Africa's population, which therefore means more than 1 billion people, will be living in cities. What does that mean in terms of the built environment? Well, it means a transition from rural homes, which are perhaps made of traditional materials, to denser urban areas, perhaps going high-rise or unable to use traditional materials anymore. Next slide, please. And what are the characteristics of those new urban areas? Well, we always struggle with the challenge of that formal city, the formal built environment growing adjacent to the informal city. And in many of our cities at the moment, half the population are living in those informal settlements, informal cities within the city. The demand for decent housing, basic services really outstrips supply. And so you've got that tension of how do you develop a built environment that's inclusive and providing services for all, when at the same time we're so conscious of the impact of the built environment on climate. And when we talk about impact, we're talking not just about the operational energy that Sean referred to earlier. That is a huge contributor of global carbon emissions, but there's also the embodied carbon, the carbon associated with the materials involved in the construction of the buildings. You can think of it in terms of capex and opex that we speak of in financial terms. The capex of the building in terms of carbon is the embodied carbon of the materials, creating the materials, bringing them to site, building with them. And the opex in terms of carbon is that operational carbon, generally associated with the energy consumption within the buildings. Next slide, please. So if you imagine the needs of the people and that growing population, but also the needs of the planet in terms of doing something to reduce the carbon footprint of the built environment. Have we moved on to the next slide, please? Okay, I'm not seeing the slides change, but let me continue.
So Caroline,
yes,
we have the decarbonisation in Africa slide at the moment with the four images.
That's perfect. Decarbonisation Africa, do nothing. If you could just now go back to the do nothing slide. Apologies, there's a delay.
Yeah, we need the do nothing slide in front of us right now.
Great, fantastic. So yeah, doing nothing is not an option. Our people have needs. I've spoken earlier about the deficit in adequate housing, in basic utilities, basic water supply and sanitation, that currently means sub-Saharan Africa is the lowest standard of living of all developing regions. We need more infrastructure. We need a better built environment. We need that service provision, not just for today's population, but for that future 1 billion people. But at the same time, we need to do something because of the effect that this has on the planet. Next slide, please. So how do we do something, but we do it appropriately? So we talk in many parts of the world about waste management, about circular economy, energy efficiency, water recycling. Of course, all of those things are possible in the formal built environment within Africa. And there are many, many initiatives in place to try and bring these in, both by regulatory reforms, but also by sort of incentivizing better practice. But then it's very difficult to talk about water efficiency to a population living in an informal settlement if you have to carry a 20-litre jerry can of water 5 kilometres and that's your water supply. Believe me, you really are very water efficient. If people don't have access to clean energy and they have no lighting within their homes, no form of electricity within their homes, you can't talk about energy efficiency. So what does it mean to do things, to do less and to have less impact on the planet, but in a very appropriate way for Africa? Next slide, please. How do we do things differently? Well, there are many different initiatives going on at the moment, and we're involved in quite a few projects that we're happy to speak about later, perhaps in some Q&A. Many initiatives to look at nature-based solutions as alternatives to grey infrastructure, traditional sort of concrete infrastructure. Flooding as a reduce of land use change and climate change is a massive issue within our African cities at the moment, as well as in many other places around the world. Do we throw massive concrete solutions to those, or do we try and maximize the opportunity for nature-based solutions within our existing cities, but of course then also protecting the green areas in the peri-urban zones around our cities at the moment that are soon going to be swallowed up as that 1 billion additional people become urban dwellers? What about using more locally sourced materials? So many of our construction materials, particularly for finishes and for building services, are imported from other parts of the world. How can we manufacture more of those locally and create jobs at the same time for that growing youth population that need meaningful employment? Are there lower carbon materials? There are many initiatives, including some that we are involved in, to see how timber and mass engineered timber can be used within everyday construction within Africa, perhaps within housing, because that is the dominant building typology that we have such a great demand for. Where can technology and innovation help us to provide decent homes, decent basic services to that growing population? Next slide, please. But at the same time, how do we make change? We need step changes because of the scale of the problem, but also going for a step change when we haven't even got food on the tables or basic water supply and sanitation is quite a challenge. So I think it's a combination of both incremental changes, beginning not just today, but yesterday, but also looking for where the step changes can come in. Just as an example, some stats from a project we've been doing in Kenya looking at housing and is there an opportunity for more timber to be used in housing in Kenya. We currently have a deficit of 2 million housing units in Kenya, and that deficit is increasing by 250,000 units per annum. There needs to be a step change in that volume of housing construction in order to be able to absorb the deficit. That 10.9 figure is only going to absorb the deficit by 2050, which is of course a long time away. How can we make every single housing unit a little bit different, a little bit more, a little bit less carbon intensive to business as usual today? And how do we come across incentives? How do we create incentives that are going to really stimulate step changes in people's thinking, both about the embodied carbon and the operational carbon? Finance is a great lever, but it needs to be appropriate targets for change, not beyond the reach, so that they're not even, so that the finance isn't even available for the projects that so badly need them. How can we incentivize those low carbon building materials, including local manufacturing of those materials, and create jobs at the same time? I do believe that there are many, many different solutions and opportunities. Sean spoke earlier about challenges, and yes, we definitely have challenges meeting the needs of people as well as the planet in Africa. But I do believe that we have many opportunities for change, both incremental and step change. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, and I do hope that there'll be some great Q&A at the end and the opportunity to talk further. But thank you very much for now.
Great. We're going to follow that now with Chris Trott from Foster & Partners.
So, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you today. It's great to be on this panel, and thank you, Sean, for inviting us. I've been asked to talk about the role of iconic projects in innovation and stimulating industry. For those of you that don't know Foster & Partners, we are a global architectural and integrated engineering practice and have built in many towns and cities throughout the world. So I talk from that perspective. I'm going to talk about some of the thinking that has been driven on a pathway over the last 10 or 15 years that we've been able to invest in this space. And this is something that we did at the time of the Paris Agreement. We actually produced a visual interpretation of it, because I don't know how many of you have ever read it, but it is it's about 70 pages. And in legal terms, it's almost all in one paragraph, quite typical of our lawyer friends. Article 2 will not be a surprise to us. It was an ambition to limit global warming to 2 degrees C, subsequently reconfirmed as 1.5 degrees C to be a safer planetary constraint. The thing at the time that didn't get quite as much airplay was Article 4, which was the balancing of sinks and emissions. So in simple terms, we have to get emissions down radically, and we have to increase absorption throughout the world. And we have to achieve that balance by 2050. This is now often termed net zero. We put a lot of effort into understanding how buildings were evaluated for 5 or 6 years before the Paris Agreement. And in many countries, there are many ways of evaluating how sustainable buildings are. And here are a selection of them in different places. And what this diagram is confirming is at the time of the Paris Agreement, none of those methodologies, even at the highest standards, were capable of delivering what we believe to be better than a 3 degrees centigrade building. So there's quite a gap to get to 1.5 degrees. Now, of course, over time, every 4 or 5 years, these get revised and they will incrementally move us towards the 1.5, but they are still significantly away from it. One of the things that we've learned to do is to calculate the amount of carbon associated with the different activities with building. And using, perhaps drawing on Caroline's terminology, she was talking about the CapEx. To us, the CapEx is the kind of the direct carbon, which is inside the materials or maybe the waste and the transport, all building the building. Something that's often overlooked also is all of the other activities that are associated with construction on site, but also the activities associated with building the plants that are making the products in the first place. And all of that carbon has to be accounted for somewhere. So that if you account for that, you do get some very high numbers in comparison to what are often seen. We look throughout the kind of supply chain, and we look throughout the aspects of the building, from setting up the site in the first place and the structure and the facades, through the services and the interiors. All of that is embodied carbon, or in Caroline's term, CapEx. We also look at energy in use, and we look at the transport impact going to and coming from a building, because when you actually build a building, it's used by people, and the transport number can be a fearsomely high number in comparison to all the other things. And we are finding an understanding of that shapes how we design the buildings in the first place. I'm going to talk to you now about 2 buildings. This was the site next to Brussels South Railway Station, which was the subject of the design competition about 5 years ago. All of those buildings in the competition brief were to be demolished and replaced with new buildings to give the prospect of the right quantities on the site. We challenged that, and we decided that we would want to keep them all and actually add supplementary area to them. So our scheme was to actually design in timber, and to put the timber above and to support it where necessary through the magnificent old concrete structures that were there. Here is a section, and we looked carefully at this, and it was because it was being done in timber, we could afford to actually carry that weight on top of the existing building. We had a very careful look at how the health and well-being aspects and environmental aspects of the building work as well. These numbers represent the carbon per square metre for each of those functions that I've described before, and we're up to about 5 tonnes over the life cycle of the whole building. Most people will be more familiar with 1 tonne or something around there, but most of them won't be considering transport, and they won't be considering 60 years worth of refit of the building, which is what happens as well, which makes them very high. And most people won't be allowing for the embodied carbon in either the pre-eminence or the services. So we then use that number to do an ecological footprint calculation. The advantage of ecological footprint is it allows for the natural use of all of the space on Earth. So it allows for carbon sequestration in growing trees. And we think that's vitally important, because it's no good having a low carbon number if there aren't enough trees to absorb it. You still have climate change. That building would be a 1.5 degrees building. I have to say, sadly, the building was not commissioned. We lost the competition. And that was because we were tripped up after 18 months worth of competition on it via some fire regulations, which today I think we could get through, but it was seen as too innovative. And that's one of the problems of being innovative, is actually you do get tripped up occasionally. I think the Wright brothers tried 100 times before they got off the ground. So I think we're in good company in respect of that. So we learned something from that. This building that I'm going to talk to you about now is the Ombu building in Madrid. There it was in 1903 when it was first built as a coal. Well, it was converting, making town gas out of coal. That was its original use. Not the prettiest of sites from being inherited. It completely surrounded by hard landscape and in relatively different. Cavernous building inside, big old space. That was it when we'd finished, as it were, the shell and core fit out. It's now being fitted out. So we put these mezzanine structures into it in timber. We replaced the cladding to the outside of the roof and replaced the glazing. It's net zero, and I'll show you why we think it's net zero now. We've greened the whole area about it and made it completely publicly accessible because we think it's important to do that. We retain 10,000 tons of masonry and bricks and just cleaned them up. We reused 12 steel trusses, which were originally in the building. We used glulam and CLT. The timber actually sequesters carbon, although a word of caution on sequestering carbon through timber. It only does it until such time as the timber eventually is at its end of life and rots, and eventually it does end up in the environment again. But certainly for the foreseeable future, it's a sequester of timber. It's a sprinklered building. Now you'll see the number, if you remember back, this is a higher number than the one we had before at 11.7. I have put into this one the 4.4, which is refurbishing the building throughout its life, which wasn't in the other one. So it's not quite like for like, but it is a higher carbon footprint than the previous building. Our ecological footprint calculations lead us to a balance of sources and sinks rather than, and so it is a net zero building. The advantage of a net zero building is it basically means you don't get that carbon going up into the atmosphere. It can be absorbed by nature, and we believe that to be a 2 degrees centigrade building. We actually think the 1.5 degrees centigrade building is a climate restorative building, because if you look at the IPCC curves, what they do is actually they do surpass 1.5 degrees centigrade mid to 2/3 through the century. And then they decline again after that. So there is some healing going on in those circumstances. So this is a 2 degrees centigrade building, and I think that might well be my last slide. So the point here is in the design of the buildings that we've undertaken, and the fact that they are pretty iconic buildings, that means that as a resource we have the opportunity to invest these types of methodologies. The methodology we used is a science-based methodology, and when we started using it, there was no other one for buildings. We actually started this in 2015. Nigel Toppin, who became the high-level climate champion in Glasgow in COP26, came into our office a couple of years before that, and he said, "Chris, you've got a science-based targets methodology," and that gave us the confidence to go on, and we've now evaluated 150 buildings this way, so we can use that methodology to help us make better decisions. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions later when Sean invites the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Great, thanks ever so much indeed, Chris. Right, we're now going to follow that with Mohammed Khalid from Johnson Controls. So, Khalid, just give me one moment whilst I bring your slides up. Oh, sorry, someone's already done that. Is that you, kindly?
Yeah, I hear you, Sean. Go ahead.
Perfect. Over to you, Mohammed Khalid.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, by the way, for having us as Johnson Control part of the event. It's very exciting. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. It has been an amazing few days at COP28, and I'm so encouraged by the progress that is being made as a global community to combat climate change. But while the outlook for a lower carbon future is promising, there is still a lot of work to be done, and the great news that everybody's doing their part in making it happen. Just a few days ago, by the way, at Johnson Control, we held our own COP28 kickoff event at the Museum of the Future on this very specific topic, decarbonizing the built environment. The museum is more than just an architecture and engineering marvel. It's an example of how the built environment can lead the way of achieving global climate targets. Our company, by the way, in Johnson, we lead the way creating many smart and sustainable buildings like the museum and others, but we focus also on spaces and places that improve the well-being to achieve the climate goals and save the financials as well, which we believe is very crucial to the overall picture of accomplishment. We use industry-leading digital solutions, building automation and hyper-efficient cooling systems to save energy and reduce emissions, while we continue to advance safety with world-class fire detection and protection and smart security systems. I think that's one of the beauties we have. When you look at buildings, it involves HVACs and controls and fire and security systems, and we believe to achieve the maximum optimum energy savings, you need to address the entire thing as a package and not look at things in silos. When I took over, by the way, it's been almost 2 years in my role as a leader for the Middle East Africa region. I knew we would be a leader in sustainable building technologies, but I could not have imagined how integral our company and the industry would be to the broader climate change discussion, which made things very exciting as well on both fronts. As we all know, being buildings do contribute to almost 40% of global emissions, but we can turn that around, and that's the good news. It becomes the biggest, quickest win in the climate race that we are going after as holistic interventor. I firmly believe that much of the opportunity lies with the private sector and with companies like us who have the power to lead the significant and sometimes difficult transitions to a lower carbon future business. Leaders do recognize the ROI, that's the good news, and the business case of sustainability. At COP, we announced initial findings from a global landmark study with Forrester Consulting that shows that a focus on sustainability has penetrated nearly every corporate organization. And sustainability does remain as one of the top 3 business priorities, which is great news. While 2/3, by the way, of our survey respondents around the world feel that they are on track to meet 2030 commitments, a full third do realize that they need to accelerate their efforts to meet the 2030 net zero goals. But what's important, and we strongly believe in that, is partnerships. This thing cannot be done alone. It has to be done in a partnership to make sure the entire ecosystem is active and it's working. So the way we do in Johnson Controls, we are partnering with customers around the world to design, to digitize, to deploy solutions to achieve the net zero. So how do we do it? The journey starts actually with designing the infrastructure with the roadmap solutions to achieve the efficiency and sustainability, decarbonizing, and the energy transition. This is very important because beyond the design, it becomes harder and harder to achieve what you're trying to achieve. We then build in and focus a lot on digitization to make the buildings smarter by connecting infrastructures with distributed generations and the grid, so we can access data, collect the data, access data that is critical to making informed decisions to solve for both, for cost and carbon, because both has to be solved for. When after that, we then deploy our solutions through a one-source turnkey delivery model that leverage best-in-class efficiency, electrification, and renewable solutions. However, we should not forget the operation and the service and maintenance part of it. It's so critical to address that piece, which is the after, and we do offer it as an as-service offering to maintain the peak operating conditions to protect our customer investment and achieve the lowest life cycle cost. We also have an ecosystem of commercial partners, making us uniquely qualified to lead the transition. This is very important because, again, to my point, it should not be done alone. It has to be done as an ecosystem from A to Z. Now, effective climate action also requires, as we will know, an urgent combination between the business and the government efforts. That's why events like COP28 are so critical to bringing all of the key stakeholders together. No doubt, government are stepping up pressure to decarbonize buildings. More and more, governments see the technology working, and they are legislating to get buildings to net zero faster, which is the right thing to do. Decarbonization is a global imperative. Recently, IPCC scientists reminded us that we have less than 7 years to cut emissions by more than 40% globally if we want to be to keep global warming 1.5 degrees Celsius. And while this is a scary fact, I'm more optimistic than ever that this is achievable because technology, solutions, and the financing do exist today. The use of AI and digital is key in our JCI solution and every other solution. We use OpenBlue in JCI as a comprehensive ecosystem of connected digital solutions for building that can break down silos and connect building systems, regardless of vendor, and make a total change to build resiliency and efficiency. And it ensures buildings become a strategic asset, providing great value and returns using dynamic AI to fine-tune buildings, multiplying energy and transmission, cool and water. Innovative financing is a game changer and will always be. There can be misconception that net zero is expensive. However, the flip side of buildings being responsible for so much climate change is that there is tremendous waste to cut. The savings from driving efficiency can pay for the upgrades. And when we use also certification, the building, what equipment like heat pumps as an example, and we harness our data with systems like OpenBlue, projects can deliver an immediate return. So as we get into our discussion here today, I want to leave with three main things. One, sustainability is no longer a thing of charity. 70% of CEOs say the sustainability has proven its financial impact. So the game has changed from nice to have to I need to have. There is significant ROI, by the way, for getting to net zero, but many can't afford the capital upfront. Therefore, it becomes important to get solutions like as a service type things. Second, digitization and AI will continue to play a huge role into this. We are just at the beginning of an era that will be defined by deep decarbonization and sustainability. The acceleration we need can only be achieved with technologies like AI, delivering critical insight that undercover a new level of efficiencies while delivering mechanisms to track and report the progress. The great news that solutions do exist today, and we just need to make sure that they are connected for a better, sustainable, and future of the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much indeed. That was great. So we're now going to follow that. We just need to unshare the screen, please, Antoinette. I think someone's whoever's sharing the slide. That's perfect. Great. So we're now going to be joined by Esther Abonio from Pennsylvania State University, and Esther's visual aids are Esther today, which is actually always brilliant. All right, so it's in terms of a nice variety. So Esther, how would you like to do this? Do you want to stand here, or would you rather sit with a microphone? Perfect. So there's a microphone on the chair, and we look forward to hearing from you, Esther. Thanks ever so much indeed.
So do see if I drop it down. Yeah, so as I was thinking about this, there's many versions of Esther, and this is true story. I'm affiliated with very many different units on campus. So there are times when I show up and I talk material science, yeah, because I'm affiliated with an initiative called Humanitarian Materials Initiative. There are times when I show up and I talk structural engineering because we're looking at things about building materials and their performance in hurricane flood-prone areas. There are times when I show up and I talk a different language, low-cost housing, low-carbon housing, energy-efficient housing. And then, when we were exchanging and I said I could talk about things which are global north, US, or I could talk about things which are global south, we settled on the global south, and I felt really good about that because, as you can tell from my accent, I originated in the global south. I was born and brought up in Nairobi. My father was born and brought up along the coast, along the shores of Lake Victoria. And I start with this story because I've noticed something has happened. There is an impact of urbanization that's happening along the shores of Lake Victoria and in most of rural Africa that is often not connected to the urban populations. I'll tell you why. When I was growing up, we used to go to visit my grandmother. Most of the buildings in the village were made out of mud. Most of the buildings in the village had grass thatch, and that includes the local school. That's me as an elementary school girl. During the pandemic, I visited my parents because of a medical thing one of them was having. And that was the first time I visited that village during the hottest month. And I was looking across the valley, a small valley, at this school that has corrugated roofing sheets and concrete walls, which is so different from when I was growing up and going back there. The school had a lot of mud walls and a lot of grass thatch roof. And I was thinking, how can these kids be learning calculus? It's impossible because it's unbearably hot. In our corrugated roofing sheet house, even with a ceiling board, we could not be indoors. My grandmother was upgraded from a mud thatched house, which when I was growing up was very cool and very pleasant. Yeah, and we upgraded her when her son went to the urban city, and they put her in a house with corrugated roofing sheet. So I kept thinking, that where they were using local knowledge, using local materials, they had a very low carbon impact. But beyond that, when I talk to these people in the village, I really can't talk to them about decarbonization. I have to talk about the impacts, the human impacts. I remember one time my mom held me by the hand and she took me to a group of women. They have a women's group that's actually doing a lot of progressive things in the village. And these women asked me, now that you have a PhD, we are very happy for you. What can you do for us? And I really didn't have an answer. So I told them the truth. I told them I really don't know, because at that particular time, I was a professor who was focusing on low carbon building materials. And I was thinking about everything that has come from outside the village, including all the brilliant ideas that I may have. Yeah, because they're not informed by the local knowledge, by the traditional knowledge, we're still going to lose something. Because they're not informed by the knowledge that my grandmother, my aunties had, where to go and source the right type of clay to use for the wall, to use for the finishing of the wall, to decorate the wall, to decorate the floor. I don't have that knowledge. So how can I come in and tell them anything about how to live sustainability? I would have to go back and spend enough time in the village and understand how systems used to work during the days when their carbon footprint was really low, and how we can integrate. I'm not against progress, but how we can integrate the modern knowledge with the climate impact. We need to be talking to the people who are living in the low income bracket, whether it's in an urban setting or a lower income setting or the rural setting. We need to be talking to them about the human impacts that they can relate to. We need to be talking to them about these children who are in schools that are overheating, children whose educational outcomes are being adversely impacted, children whose quality of sleep at night is being adversely impacted, and it's also impacting the educational and learning outcomes during the day. That is the language that needs to be accompanying any conversation about lowering the footprint of buildings within the African context. I also couldn't help thinking that it's people like me. Yeah, I'm not exactly doing it, but there are people like me, the diaspora. We are investing heavily in our home countries. And we are putting up these massive, massive structures that are supposed to be a status symbol. We don't live in those houses, but that is what we do. There is no messaging that is coming to the diaspora that is telling the people who are living in the diaspora that this is not just bad because it's an individual action, but it's also the message that you're sending to the rest of the village. Similar to the urban people like my dad who are upgrading their parents, there are people in the diaspora who, because they're doing things like this, people are looking at us and thinking that, this means they've arrived. So if I've arrived, I need to have a roof that is similar to the professor from Penn State. I need to have a walling that is similar from the professor. You compare yourself. There is a real social stigma that's surrounding the use of locally available, locally resourced materials because of that. And then the third conversation actually happened in one of our initiatives, which is climate health and the built environment. I'm co-leading this with somebody from the College of Medicine. And earlier on, many years ago, like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, in one of the early conversations, we were trying to find this common denominator of things which we can do together. And I remember this doctor being very, very happy when he had a professor in the School of Architectural Engineering. And he tells me that, we need to talk because we're doing things in Western Africa. I think he mentioned Ghana. And he was saying, we are renovating buildings. And I was very interested. I wanted to know, what exactly are you doing? And then he tells me that because of vector-borne diseases, there are ceiling openings and they're sealing, vents and all that kind of thing to try to make the indoor environment the building actually less attractive to mosquitoes. There's scientific evidence that shows that concrete and corrugated roofing sheets repel mosquitoes. So I was very fascinated by this, but we started a debate because I told him, what you're doing is actually terrible from other perspectives. And this has actually opened a very interesting line of inquiry of research that's been going on up to the present time that we have in partnership and collaboration with people in the College of Medicine and the School of Public Health to try to find this sweet spot. We don't think that one side is right. We don't think that we should rule out the concerns that they have about vector-borne diseases and the use of biomaterials. This is a reality. There is evidence that there is a problem. But then at the same time, there's also evidence on the other side that shifting the practice to corrugated roofing sheets and concrete is also not an answer. It's not affordable. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for extreme heat mitigation. And we are enjoying having this challenge, these debates where we try to find, where is the optimal, where can we balance things out, optimize things. And I wish that I could have a conversation with a group of women now. They should ask me again, what can you do for us now that you have a PhD? Because the things that I've learned over the last 2 years have changed my perspective completely. And before I finish, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the educational aspect, because as a professor, I educate. And I don't think we do enough to integrate what we know with the learning that is happening at the level of the universities. I don't think we're doing it even in K-12, but even at the universities, these are the next generation of professionals. These are the next architects, engineers, planners, etc. We're still teaching them largely using the methods that were used when I was in school and when my professor was in school, meaning that we're still in disciplinary silos. A lot of the things that we're talking about in this conference, the students that we have in my department will only get very, very small bits and pieces of it. They are still going to design their houses and make a lot of the decisions based on things which we know do not work very well. So we have some models which we are exploring, trying to push students out of their comfort zone. One example is something that actually emerged out of a synergy with the School of Business, trying to bring entrepreneurial orientation into the discourse, creating challenge-based courses where we give students, problems such as extreme heat, and we create, design criteria that you have a budget of X. Assume you're designing something that will be useful for a school in rural Kenya. And I'm very pleasantly surprised to see that the students are responding very positively to this. And I'm talking about a group of students that's not just from the built environment, mechanical engineering, industrial engineering, any form of engineering that you can think about. We've gone through these programs with them. And it's not just the learning, but also how the students are responding and telling us that, this was eye-opening because had they not had this in the context of the class, they would never really have thought about this. And then we are also experimenting with having cross-listed classes with the College of Liberal Arts. We are piloting a class this semester that we are calling African Urban Future. And it's attracting students from political science, geography, etc., and then also engineering. different backgrounds in engineering, not just one type of engineering. And as the instructors, one of the instructors, I'm actually very humbled when I hear the rich discussions and debates that are happening in the class. The students are telling us something. Yeah, they are not oblivious to the things which are going on around us, and they just miss the opportunity, people to just challenge them and help to situate them in the real world context that is different from the business as usual. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Esther, thank you ever so much indeed. Right, we're now going to move to a series of Q&A. So I've got a few grenades of my own that I'm going to throw at some of our panelists. So could I invite Chris and Esther to come to the front, and Caroline, Khalid, if you would unmute when you're answering a question, that would be great. So we've heard a number of angles here this morning regarding the opportunities and challenges within the built environment, and sort of I think what we've really heard is that we've got the pressures of actually, for example, the urbanization in contexts such as Africa, and the massive changes and opportunities within a context like that. And in the other extreme, we've got sort of the high-end buildings and what we might be able to do. So some of these sort of the bigger buildings, for example, that Khalid and Chris have been looking at. So we have a large spectrum of challenges as we look at a future society. So what I'm going to start with is with Caroline and with Esther, and really just thinking about today. Although it's the Built Environment Day, we mustn't think about climate change in isolation. So the multidisciplinary changes that have been referenced, for example, by Esther, and the way that we think about teaching and education, perhaps in silos. We need to think about the built environment, but with other challenges for society going forwards as well, and equity being one of those. So what I really want to think about and ask is that, first of all, Esther, you talked about upgrading, and I'm not sure it was an upgrade if we're putting people into environments which have got corrugated roofs, which are then overheating. So and maybe Caroline, you might follow as well, but thinking about the context such as Africa and the urbanization, so the benefits that we see and can provide for humanity in a more urban environment, but the use of local knowledge, the use of local materials, and actually what it matters in terms of lifestyle and values for those for the people. And do they really want to come into the areas that we might think of as what's worked maybe for the global north? Do we have to go and repeat things that we've created, these mega cities or more urban environments? What's the right way of thinking about the development in places like Africa? So maybe Esther, we could start with you, if you could reflect on that.
So yes, you're right in saying that the upgrade is not really an upgrade if you think about the human health and well-being perspective, but that's not a consideration per se at that particular time when the design decisions are being made, because they're going after social status. So I think the right approach is to find ways of celebrating the local knowledge. Like as I said, if I go to the village now, I will struggle to find examples of the structures that were there when I was a little girl. The well-designed traditional huts that are very nicely decorated, they don't exist anymore. And I think maybe that is the starting point. How do we create a celebration around this? How do we create maybe a museum or some demonstrations where young people can see what I saw, because they're not seeing this. They don't see any other alternative. What they're seeing is what they call them the Nairobi people. When Nairobi people show up in the rural areas, they make a big statement to say, I have money. And then this creates this ripple effect. I've seen this happening also in Tanzania, that people will build, they will build what they can afford. And then over time, they create a perimeter wall using concrete blocks. And it's again about the social status and the communication that if this is made out of mud, then it is lower quality. It means you're poor. And even if you're poor, you don't want people to know you're poor. So I think the shift needs to happen with the middle income group. They need to be sensitized to be shown that if this thing is well designed, it can actually work to the betterment of everybody. And then I think the other thing which I mentioned, our curriculum, our educational system needs to be transformed. It's stuck. in the African context, especially in the US, there's been investments that have been made since 2008, mostly 2010, to try to transform how we're educating our students. The African continent needs to go through a similar transformation. Making some changes to, allow social scientists to take some classes with the architects and engineers, bring in the political scientists, bring in different people, at least to some of the classes, to studio classes, to challenge the way they are thinking.
And Caroline, perhaps if I could ask you to also comment on this, and I was particularly struck by the graph that you showed that looked at, I know they're only models, but you looked at the basically different forecasts, but it was showing a massive deficit, right, until shortly before 2050, and then by 2050, then that deficit is actually then reversed, so that we have excess. But the intervening period, you were basically showing that we're going to have a huge problem if we're going to be urbanizing Africa in the way that is currently forecast. So could you comment on what you see as a sort of a different pathway?
Yeah, so it's not just a case of urbanizing. So Esther's been speaking very much about those sort of rural or perhaps peri-urban areas. But the urban growth is coming, to a large extent from population growth. And that's why, we have to come back to those population figures. We can't do nothing. Something will have to happen. And the question is, will those people who are yet to be born, will they be living in, good quality, decent accommodation, or will they be living in really inadequate, inadequate housing and continue with that lack of services, which is so prevalent today? I think Esther's making very good points about that indigenous knowledge, and I think there's a real tension for those of us. I mean, she referred to Nairobi people. I'm one of them. There's that aspiration that comes with city dwellers that, well, we have to live in concrete apartment blocks. We have to, we live in concrete houses, even if it's single story sort of urban areas, as perhaps in Tanzania. And so the challenge of going back to the traditional materials, even timber, or maybe compressed earth blocks, or rammed earth, cement stabilized earth blocks, those sorts of technologies. Well, actually, that's how people used to build. They built because people like Esther's aunt knew exactly where to get the right soils with the right sort of clay content that would give them robust dwellings. But do modern people, that middle income people, do they want to live in those sorts of houses? So I think we have to, bear in mind those social, what's acceptable socially, and that is a challenge in terms of bringing in new technologies that perhaps aren't actually so new after all. And there needs to be some sort of showcasing of the good quality environments that can be built through those types of technologies. But I think we also very much have to look for co-benefits. So, for instance, in some of our nature-based solutions work, how do you bring nature back into cities? Well, urban agriculture is one of them. And so, people in urban areas, they still struggle to buy food. Just because food might be available in shops or in markets doesn't mean to say they have the cash with which to buy that food. So having small areas for urban agriculture can really help, both in terms of maintaining soils for reducing runoff and those impacts of climate change, but also, providing areas for people to grow their own food. So I think we have to be always looking for these co-benefits, but that thing to do with language and communication, here's a solution that worked in the developed world, let's apply it here, that's not going to work. So we can't avoid the problems of urbanization, densification, needing to go high rise, so as we don't just spread the city, low rise, create more transport problems, because we're getting to that just urban sprawl everywhere. But at the same time, we have to look for solutions which are bringing benefits to the people as well as to the planet. I hope that adds a little bit to the conversation. Thank you.
That was great. Before we move to the floor, I was going to just ask, I really yeah, I appreciate the point, Caroline, about densification and therefore actually, no, we don't want urban sprawl. But I was very taken by what you said, Chris, with the, you know, the plan of not necessarily just thinking concrete. And you said, well, it's concrete plus timber. I know that, you know, maybe that didn't quite make it out, but these are different ways of thinking about amalgams of different materials to perhaps try and create a solution which has got more natural materials in those buildings. You mentioned timber on top of concrete. What's the future? Can we think about more of these hybrid structures? Because it's pretty rare, in my experience, to have seen buildings with that kind of thinking. Oh, so we should turn that on, Chris.
I think natural based solutions definitely have their place. I don't think timber is going to be the right answer for very big buildings, but it can be the right answer for parts of very big buildings, and that's really a strength thing. It doesn't make a great deal of difference to a timber slab, which is what I showed in the one project, if it's on a ground floor, a first floor, or a second floor, or if it's 50 or 60 floors up in the air. But so you know, there can be a hybrid world where we have timber used at the right spans appropriately, and then we use other materials which are much stronger to take us much higher, much wider spans. And that, so we see that, provided we bear in mind the other kind of issues around timber, such as you know, the fire issues of timber, and I think that lessens being very quickly. So I think they do have their place. I think one of the advantages of timber is it's light. I mean, in comparison to a building that might be made of concrete, it's not a reasonable thing into its weight or somewhere in the order of the weight, which does mean that you can do things as we were showing, which is to kind of add more space above existing buildings, because they will often be strong enough to take that type of additional weight, or if necessary, just strengthen the structure in order to take that weight. So I do think that there's a place for hybrid, but I think the other thing that was the feature of the two schemes I showed you, you know, and they were both in the development, they were both existing buildings, and the message there is, don't knock them down and use what you've already got. And that's why they have a relatively good environmental prognosis looking forward, because the bits that were already there simply didn't need to get built again. And you know, the whole is it's a bit like running the 100 meters. With a building like that, you're starting 60 meters down the track. So, you know, we have to get the value of what's already there, not knock it down unless there's any alternative. Something like 80% of all the buildings that are likely to be on Earth in 2050 are already on Earth. So it's not the new that's going to solve this problem, it's the old that's going to solve this problem.
Right, super. Okay, we're going to go to the floor. Khalid, I've got various questions for you, so don't worry, I'm going to come back to you. But let's go to the floor first.
Yeah.
Raring to go here because I spent the last few years thinking and studying the African urban housing problem.
Do give your name.
Sorry, Scott Francisco, represent a few organizations. Cities for Forests is one of them, and we're working with cities all over the world. And you know, penciling out the numbers, like Carolyn showed, we came up with 250 million housing units in cities in Africa over the next 25 years. So that's based in 10 million a year. That would be like building New York City every single year from ground up, complete new construction every single year. That's already taking into account existing buildings and some refurbishments. So the do nothing, of course, is not an option, and building in concrete is also not an option if you're going to be anywhere close to our climate targets. So we've got a pretty massive conundrum. And by the way, we can't retrofit our way out of this problem because these are new buildings that need to be built. So we've got to also take care of the existing stock and build new to accommodate the population projections. In addition, that's not the rural housing. That's your wonderful story. It's so great. And then what lessons can we learn to apply towards the urban? But we are talking about high density, medium and high density buildings that won't be built out of those traditional materials. To quickly come back to say the Fosters and Partners outlook on iconic building, a challenge I would say would be, can a firm like Fosters and Partners build design an urban building that takes those lessons from the rural material source and the latest technology of low carbon materials. I mean, I just say every building is a hybrid building. There's no such thing as a non-hybrid building. So let's just say it's all hybrid. It's only a question of proportionality. And I mean, most of the timber buildings, the high tall timber buildings now are all hybrid, right? And even the ones that are like 95% timber, they're still relying on steel and the connectors, a lot of times through the lateral. So it's very likely that it's going to need to be timber. That a significant percentage of that 250 million housing units are going to have to be bio-based if we're going to reach our target. All of them will be hybrid in some fashion or another. So the challenge of modeling the right ratio that is appropriate for the context, takes the local culture into account, is enormous.
So what's your question?
It's not even a question. It's just, I guess if I was to put it into question, it's what can we see in the next 2 years? Let's just say I'll go to Foster's and Partners.
Well, I'm going to go to Foster's and Arabs actually with
And
this. All right. So
show us.
So let's.
We're one of the big partners in that work. Show us what that building looks like today, tomorrow, so that the world can look at it and emulate and build upon that example.
So we'll go to Chris first and then to Caroline. We can give that to Chris.
Okay, thank you. So it's a good question. Thank you. The answer is always going to be context specific, I think, is the reality. I mean, I take the point there's a lot of new to be built in the developing world because it's not already there. The two buildings that I showed are both European buildings and they had European timber. The one wasn't built, but we are doing others that are in the pipeline already. They are being built using European timber. So there's no reason that can't happen, but provided you work within the capacity and the strength of timber that you have available. The old building I showed you had timber mezzanine structures in it and the suspended floors. But I think there's a kind of there is another way to look at it. There's not only the materiality in terms of learning from nature, and what Esther was saying is very much learning about it. It was a bit back into the future, I suppose, if I could call it that. So not so very far away, we have Mazda City, something that we designed that's been there now for 7 or 8 years. That's very much in this context, learn from local vernacular. It has narrow streets, so they're well shaded. It uses appropriate reflecting materials where necessary, and it uses a lot of greenery in amongst the buildings. So it's informed by nature, it's informed by the physics of nature, and planning of it is done that way. So I think there is a contemporary version of learning from nature, and that's a good local example here. And I think that is the way forward. I think if we look back at what nature has done well, reinterpreted with the science that we have available, the data we have today, available today, that's the route forward.
Great. And Caroline, would you like to say something as well?
Sure, great. Yeah, absolutely great point being made there. And I'd just like to share that the housing graph that I showed for Kenya comes from a study that we're in the middle of doing to look at that question of what can we do tomorrow, as opposed to, looking ahead to when mass engineered timber or maybe some other sort of technologies are adoptable in terms of the regulatory authorities and everybody becoming sort of okay with sort of changing how we do urban buildings, particularly the housing typologies. And the simple answer is we can go back to using sawn timber floor joists with a concrete topping and substitute some of those elements of the building just for the floor slabs, and looking at internal partitions within apartments as well. So we're not talking about changing the vertical structure, that will still be concrete. We're not talking about changing, fire stairs, escape stairs and things, those will still be concrete. But if we just substitute and create hybrid flooring systems in the typical apartment typology that we get so commonly across our cities, in this case specifically Kenya, but would apply elsewhere, then we can actually save in 1 year's worth of construction the equivalent of the entire carbon emissions of Nairobi City for 2022. So that substitution element only allows for, basically offsetting last year's carbon footprint of the city. That's a huge impact. It's a small change by switching to a very acceptable sort of hybrid solution in terms of that typical building technology or typology. But at the same time, it has a huge impact in terms of the substitution element of embodied carbon. So that's something that we're working on at the moment. The whole point is to build up an evidence base to be able to have conversations with the authorities and try and get this adoptable, even become part of the government's affordable housing agenda. And can this become the new business as usual for a certain building typology? That's something that's for this year, next year, the year after, even as we still look for more innovative solutions for the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, of course. Make sure that's on.
Okay, yeah, so I actually do a lot of urban stuff. I just decided to wear the hat of the women in the village for this conversation. But building on what Caroline talked about, innovative solutions, I'm a researcher as well. And I wanted to highlight one example of a technology that we are researching. It's based on cold sintering technology, and it's my collaboration with People and Material Science. So we are trying to produce a brick that has the same properties as fire bricks at room temperature. And right now we are maybe at the size of half this icon. So we can do this. But our next step is to try to get it to the size of a brick. So we are also doing things which are trying to address the need to produce large volumes of material. And I think this is a place where collaborating with Caroline and also with you, Chris from Foster, can help us understand how to bridge that gap between research that's being done in the university and the real world applications where we need these hybrid solutions.
Great. So I've got a question for Khalid. Khalid, what we've heard is that we do have a problem, for example, with overheating, with some of the methods of construction, and therefore, not being appropriate for thermal comfort in places, perhaps without air conditioning. And as a general rule, we seem to be more reliant on air conditioning for cooling today than we were certainly 50 years ago. With intelligent controls and looking at energy storage, not just in terms of electrical energy storage, but thermal energy storage and things like this. Is this something that is being factored into the future thinking of control systems about how we might not necessarily reduce the overall energy consumption of the built environment, but certainly reduce its peakiness and therefore reduce the capacity needs and therefore actually help decarbonize the built environment by making the overall load just less peaky? Is there thinking going on at the moment in terms of the way that we control the built environment within the work of Johnson Controls, for example?
Yeah, no, Sean, I mean, absolutely. That's a very fundamental kind of way of thinking. And it has to be the way as we go forward. Like I mentioned earlier, 40% of the emissions are coming actually out of buildings. And there's another study, if I remember correctly, 75% of the buildings that exist today will remain to exist through 2050, just for the fact they are actually newer, like maybe 10 to 15 years old buildings. So when it comes to HVAC and the control and the fire and the security of the building, if you think about it, they are at the end of the day, they are all connected into one ecosystem. And, the fact that work in the front of development and the equipment alone of HVAC, and then connecting that into a digital system that extract the data and extract the intelligence out of it to put it into our controls, being a BMS or, and in our case would be an open system. That's when you get the value as we go forward. So to your question, it's definitely the way that we see it as must be the way forward, and that's what we are working on for sure.
Thank you. So I have a question for actually maybe a number of you, but Chris mentioned that 80% of the buildings, at least, that are going to exist in 2050 are already with us. Now that's clearly a great thing in terms of in terms of just the amount of building that we need to do. It's a terrible thing though, because refurbishing buildings is a right it's the right challenge compared with doing something right from the very beginning. And I'm worried and concerned about the refurbishment, and in particular looking at the decarbonisation of domestic buildings. I mean, we've talked, so Khalid and Foster and Partners work, I think, a lot in the non-domestic sector, but the domestic buildings in, for example, Northern Europe and the UK as an example, you know, we've got just, you know, a raw pain because we've got so much of our heating provided by basically gas today. We had a, you know, that massive transition, and that's just one example. How are we going to decarbonize existing buildings going forwards, especially with those that are heated currently with fossil fuels, and getting them weaned off to maybe an electric form of heating system, call it a heat pump if you like, but an electric form of heating system, and then moving the burden, therefore, at least to the electricity supplier, to then have a carbon-free source of energy for heating in homes. We'd like to take that one.
I can give it a go. I'll have something to say about it as well in a minute. By happy coincidence, I've just converted the house myself personally to become a net zero carbon house. So I bought a house and did the conversion. And it's going to be very different for different types of houses and in different locations. You know, one of the drivers for this, if you can, is to generate renewable energy on site, which often the houses you can. I mean, conventional houses that are only 1 or 2 or 3 stories, you get a very high proportion of the electricity from the roof. The problem is you get it at the wrong time of the year if you actually want to heat it with heat pump. So I think the grid has a lot to do with this, and where does that go, and the smartness of the grid. But nevertheless, the hybrid months and the summer months is a very good way of going. I think mobility in cars have something to do with it. I think we've actually got to get very used to using cars to store energy, so as we've got the energy in the batteries when it's necessary. I've got some static batteries, but again, they don't rate as highly as the car. The car has got a lot more energy capacity than the static batteries have. So my next step is going to actually to be able to import and export using the car as a means of storage. But you've got to have smartness. To the heating point, and I do agree it's got to be electric. Heat pumps are kind of seen as the panacea, and we've heard the stories why. But heat pumps are actually quite a big ask in the majority of domestic buildings. Unless you've got the space to put them in, and not everybody has the space to put them in, you're looking for something which is probably working at the level of a group of houses or something of that nature, with a small distributed system you put in. I've seen some encouraging examples of mass storage points. My very first house, and I'm going back 40 years now, had electric storage heaters in it. And that was at the point that the heat came out. That's where the electricity went in, and they were just full of bricks. And they stored the heat that when it was off-peak electricity. You can actually get boilers to that now, because you can charge them off-peak. And they are drop-in substitutes for gas-fired boilers. And that means you can retain all your radiators and all your existing piping, which I think is an advantage going forward, because most people aren't going to be able to find the time, the energy, or the money to rip up all their floors and to put underfloor heating. It's a much bigger ask. So I think it's smarter technology, and I think it's used in a smarter way. And I think if I just one last thing, well, we've looked at this for large new cities. If you're smart with the way you design the infrastructure and the electrical infrastructure, you can probably look after all of the electric mobility with around about 15 to 20% more capacity than you would have done in any of a normal non-electrified mobility city. But you've got to be super smart about when things are charged and when they're not charged. Because if you do it the wrong way, you'll end up with twice the capacity of the electrical infrastructure. So I think that smartness is absolutely key to it.
Yeah. Esther, do you want to say something?
So I'm reflecting on the US context now, where my other hat. So some of the biggest challenges are within the low-income households. And then there's also an opportunity there. So what the work we've been doing in collaboration with the people in the health sector has made us understand that within the US, there's actually funding available from the healthcare sector that can be used to help pay for installing some of the things that Chris talked about. So I'll give you an example. In Pennsylvania, there's a program that's called CHIP, and all you need is proof that there is a child who's at risk because of the housing condition, and the doctor can write a prescription for the issue in the house to be fixed. But having said that, the second surprise that we also had, we discovered that this program is not being used as much as it can be. In fact, most of the money goes back to the federal government. There is a low uptake on the consumer side. I think there was a talk we attended previously where they were telling us, we attended with my colleague, they were talking about the technologies being available. Even when the technology is available, sometimes the demand side is not ready because of lack of awareness, lack of incentives to help people to ask for these solutions. So I just wanted to put that there, that there's some opportunities for leveraging healthcare dollars, but that will also require a lot of advocacy and awareness campaign to be able to take full advantage of that. And then quickly flipping back to my Global South hat, as you're talking about the retrofits, I think in the African context, there are very many houses that are in existence right now that are not climate smart. And we also need to be talking about how to address the issues of these houses that were not designed for the current weather.
Indeed, indeed. Any questions before? No. Oh, we're going to bring you the microphone if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Manar from the University of Cambridge. Maybe a question for Esther. So I'm originally Saudi Arabian, and when Caroline was presenting, I was first thinking, oh, are there lessons to be learnt where they've done it well? To be honest, I don't know if there is a place where they've done it well, but I can certainly point out where they've not done it well, such as in the Gulf. So traditionally mud houses, thatched roof, palm thatched roofs and the like, and they've gone the concrete, huge buildings. But I think there's an opportunity and lessons to be learned from the changing attitudes. And I wonder if this is something you can implement in the education part. So in my parents' generation, they grew up in the mud houses. By the time they were adults, they were building enormous villas, concrete villas, all self-builds. And now by the time they're going into retirement, and my generation is there, the cost of living is prohibitive. And so you can either afford water or you can afford the power for these kinds of dwellings. And so there is a huge social shift away from these enormous villas and, prioritization of being able to afford something smaller. So now there's a move towards much smaller houses, and the price of utilities is becoming a really big determining factor on where people choose to live. And this is not something anyone would have predicted. And now there's these basically empty villas because people can't afford to live in them anymore. And they're certainly destined for demolition because nobody's refurbishing. But I just wonder if this is something, to take away a lesson in maybe a projection of social attitudes as the economies change and the cost of living changes going forward, just to make people aware.
So, Esther, would you like to respond?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I think we can use these experiences, talk about them, document them first of all. I don't think they are well documented. People don't know that there's a problem that the previous generations have experienced that the current generation and future generations can learn from. And just building on your example, one of the things that I didn't get to share, my parents live in a modern house, concrete and everything. My mom fell. If she was in a traditional house, she would not have fallen. Yeah, because the house is not age friendly. So I think in addition to the cost of living in those houses, there's the human health cost that as you grow older, then we need to be thinking about, is this concrete, very nice glossy finish, the right type of floor for an aging population? So those are all very valid points, and I wish we could document them so that it's scientific evidence that can be shared to the next generation.
Caroline, did you want to say something or not?
Yeah, I was just going to add, both on the previous question or previous discussion and this one, the way that we have to try and get into the psychology of people. So when we think again about, you know, the developed world, and you were talking about Northern Europe or something, where you're talking about how do you get from a gas, you know, gas heating system to maybe heat pumps or something else, and assume that those are running off a renewable grid. I think there's also a question there about people's perception about quality of living, which comes into where we're talking about with the examples from the Gulf. Because, you know, quality of living has been, I'm now speaking with a UK hat on, you know, you can live in a house and put the central heating on 24 degrees, you can go around there's snow on the ground outside, but you're going around the house in a t-shirt, you're not even putting a sweater on, or socks on your feet or something like that. And so how can we shift people's perception that actually it's okay, you don't have to live at 24 degrees, 22 degrees, or, you know, 21, 20 degrees, it's still okay. You just have to expect to dress differently for that situation. And I think that's the same thing as we're speaking about in the Gulf. The expectation is, okay, huge villa, that's the right quality of living, but actually it's not sustainable. In this case, you know, in the example that was given, financially sustainable. So how do we end up by using, and I'd actually wonder what Mohammed Khalid, you know, thinks about this in terms of communication systems and control systems, being able to start to re-educate people about the environment in which they're living, and sort of begin to shift people's expectations. Because I think that human element about what is right, yes, there's a basic standard. The child that is unable to function properly, perhaps, you know, the Pennsylvania example, because their house is just too cold and it starts to impact their health. Clearly, that's an extreme that we wouldn't be advocating for, in the same way as in the rural home or the rural school. It's too hot for children to be able to learn properly. There are boundaries which I think must be deemed unacceptable and not right for society. But then I think we need a bit more flexibility in terms of our understanding about what is right, and how we as humans are very good at adapting ourselves when needs arise. And how can we use technology to start to educate people in a different way to do with that acceptable, and teaching ourselves to adapt again in the way that we've slightly forgotten how to do.
If you could respond to Caroline, but also could you also reflect on what Chris mentioned regarding we need more intelligence in homes as well. You know, we need smart, we need to do this smart.
Yeah, and it's a very valid question, Caroline. Thanks for bringing it up. I think, you know, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a combination of both things, the education part and the technology part, and then how we connect the two to make one. So one of the approaches that we're going about is where you have the intelligence in the system of the house actually trying to even give recommendation and command more than, you know, just recommending. So you have the science behind how do you connect what you have in a building or in a house. How do you gather this data? How do you make science of it? How do you make some intelligent recommendations out of it? But not just to give the recommendation in educational form, but to also to influence what's happening inside automatically. Now, honestly, I think if you just take one, not the other one, in a silo, it will take so much time to trying to change the perception of what people are entitled to and what they should do and what they need to do. It has to be both at the same kind of and the same box of trying to drive the outcome out of this effort. And that's how we are going about it. So it's for us, I mean, that's why we are actually today, if you think about how we are approaching building, we are not just talking about equipment in a silo, or we're not just talking about the well-being or the behavior of an individual, of you know, someone who's actually residing in the building. We're talking about the complete solution, the end-to-end cycle of what is it and what does it take to be occupying a place, and how does the individual kind of behaves with the building, but at the same time, how does the building also behaves with the individual? And that's the intelligence piece. It has to be done this way. It has to be kind of next, you know, in kind of in parallel work stream to get the maximum outcome out of this solution, but not as, you know, you have an HVAC equipment and you have an equipment and you have a control system. If you think about it that way and you approach it that way, the end result or the outcome of the entire ecosystem will not be to the levels that we are hoping, you know, to see. It has to be done as one kind of package to get the max. Hope this clarifies, you know, your question.
Thank you, Khalid. So I've got a question which is actually looking at the challenge of refurbishment, and it's refurbishment of existing homes. So small story to start with, which is yes, we have a home in England. Now it happens to be a home of about 15 years old, so not very, very old. It's not mega new, but it happened to be a home that was pretty well insulated and unusually with underfloor heating everywhere. And it's off grid. So when it was built, it had an oil boiler. And last year, the oil boiler basically blew up. So I woke up in the morning and the house was full of smoke. It was quite interesting waking up to that kind of environment. And it was in the depth of winter. And so I called the guy that normally services the boiler and said, look, what do I do? And at that time he just said, well, Sean, you need a new oil boiler. And I said, well, okay, but should I use this as an opportunity to move away from an oil boiler? And at the time he said, well, you could do an air source heat pump, Sean, but the air source heat pump is 15 to 18,000 pounds. The oil boiler was, I think, 6,000 pounds. And the house doesn't use that much. So it also said I could basically do the oil boiler tomorrow. So that's what I did. It's the worst decision I've ever made, as you will now learn, because earlier this year, tried to get a delivery of oil, and you paid for it, and then the company then telephoned me and said, sure, we can't deliver the oil. I said, what's the matter? Is the gate locked? He said, no, the gate's open, but the oil tank has got a split in it. Okay, well, how much is the new oil tank? Well, we can't, regulations have changed, so you needed a bunded oil tank. What's a bunded oil tank? Well, it's double skinned, so it's much bigger. Okay, well, can you do one of those? Well, we can't do one of those in the same location because the pad's not big enough. Well, okay, can you build a bigger pad? No, we can't build a bigger pad because the gas tanks, it's too close. Come on, how much is it going to be? So it was £4,000, all right, for just a new oil tank. It was £6,000 that I spent on a new oil boiler the previous year. And the government has now put in place, it's actually increased, but a financial incentive for £5,000 to allow you to switch from your fossil fuel source to an air source heat pump. So you run the numbers, actually there was a zero cost, all right, difference for me to have decarbonised my home, to have said, right, I'm going to use the opportunity of a bit of kit falling over. And if one bit of kit is falling over, the next one's going to fall over soon because they've all got a finite life. And yet I didn't have, apparently I'm sort of reasonably familiar with the built environment. And I didn't have the wherewithal and the capacity to make an informed decision at that time in terms of the financial incentives. Where, this is how bad things are, okay, where we're trying to decarbonize the built environment. And yet even those of us who are semi-intelligent, all right, aren't making the right decisions or not being provided with the information to help them make us the right decisions. And yet we're at the other extreme, we're trying to decarbonize the whole of society. So I'd really like us to reflect and say, look, what are some of the simple things, the easy wins that we need to get implemented like tomorrow? And it might be no additional incentives, just get more information out there of the stuff that we can do in a way that's going to be really accessible. But clearly there are additional incentives because, as Chris said, there are going to be certain buildings that don't have underfloor heating systems that are not going to be easy to sort of switch from from the old fossil fuel to a fossil-free form of energy supply. How are we going to get society to decarbonize the existing built environment in a timescale that matters? Who's going to take this one first? You take it.
I'll have a go if you want. I think I could be quite rich if I can answer that question. To be honest, short, and it's not an easy pathway. I agree. I mean, as I kind of said earlier, when I did my own house, and I do know something about this kind of area, having spent 35 years in this field. I had the gas supply taken out when I bought the house. I actually had it taken out, so I didn't want to pay standing charge of the gas. I then found that I had the pleasure of having a 3-phase power supply into the building in order to support the air source heat pump. Well, that alone cost £6,000. And that was before I had the heat pump. The heat pump, I think, cost about £7,000 or £8,000. But in fairness, there is the renewable heating incentive, so I do get a grant for the heat pump. About 7 years, it will pay back the whole allowance. So that will come back over a period of time, but it's still available. All I have to do once a year is to fill out a little form that is sent to me online. And it's not even technical. It just says things like name, address, did you have a problem with the heat pump, has it broken down, that type of stuff. But £1,700 a year comes in my direction as a result of that, and it took about 10 minutes to fill it in, but I actually did it. So that's good. But having said that, and you think they're going to run quite cheaply, and this isn't necessarily answering your question, but this is what I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about the cost of off-peak electricity at the moment. My wife, who tracks these things quite carefully in terms of what it's costing to run this installation, and I think it came back to some of the comments that was being made earlier about, if you've got the technology to track it. She looked at it, she said, sweetheart, it cost us £37 yesterday to run the heat pump, and that was last week. It didn't get above -1 in the United Kingdom last week. I've got a couple of batteries that I charged up at cheap rate over 4 hours that I have a cheap rate electricity. 3 hours later, all that was gone, and then for the rest of the day, I was straight off the grid at peak electrical prices. So they are pretty expensive to run when the weather is very, very cheap. So we've got to do something about the electrical infrastructure and the way the tariff structure is set up to make more cheap rate electricity available. If we want people to decarbonise by going in the electrical direction, whatever the technology that hands off them, that is an infrastructure problem, and something that's got to be done about that. I think done about that in a big way. The other thing that I think we need to think more carefully about in countries where we've got gas infrastructure. I mean, the whole thing about the electric infrastructure, we're about to strand the whole network in gas, which is there. The only way I can see of using that is hydrogen. And I do think to me, it's not a done deal that hydrogen won't be used in those pipes in the future. I mean, once upon a time, we went from town gas to natural gas. And I can remember that quite clearly. You can buy hydrogen-ready boilers today. And I do actually think, given that we've got the infrastructure in place to deliver gas in whatever form at the houses, I think in countries with gas infrastructure, I do think hydrogen has a lot more role to play than we're giving it credence for.
So I'm going to interrupt. I guess it's the chair's prerogative. I mean, I do have a bee in my bonnet regarding hydrogen for heating in homes, Chris. In other words, because the huge inefficiency that you get because you're burning gas to provide heating and then burning hydrogen. But if we have Khalid and others who are able to really help us with intelligence and with the peak lopping, so that actually we provide the energy needs, but in a much more sustainable way without the peakiness of the grid. And you mentioned this earlier. Will that not somehow assuage your concerns regarding the capacity of whatever infrastructure that we have? Yes, it will need bolstering, but does it need bolstering as much as we fear it will do if we can just get that peakiness smoothed out?
Well, I suspect what it means is we upgrade a lot of the electrical infrastructure that's in the final distribution circuits to houses, rather than the big transmission infrastructure. I think that's probably where the upgrade comes.
Great, good. Anyone else wanted to comment on my question regarding decarbonisation? Yeah.
So research that we're doing in Pennsylvania, and we've had focus group discussions, interviews. We've also done surveys, and some of the discussions that we had were surprising because a group of people, 20 people in a room or 10 people in a room, you find 9 of them out of 10 know something. None of them don't know, 9 don't know, and 1 knows. And even the ones who don't know, instead of saying, oh, tell us more, they're like, how do you know this? So what you're saying about information not being accessible easily is actually a real problem. Building on a discussion that my colleague Olivia and I joined this morning, it was by the World Meteorology Organization. Yeah, and they were talking with journalists, and I picked up something that reminded me of an experience that we had in Florida a few years ago. He was saying that the attention span of the public is very limited. It's very hard to get information about, things which can help, like decisions that they can make, behavior changes that can help. But when we have these extreme weather events, whether it's extreme cold or flooding or things like that, you're saying, now they have scientific evidence that for a certain number of days, you can get people's attention. So sharing now the experience of what happened in Florida when I was living there, the temperatures hit sub-zero. And all of us, we cranked up our heating systems. We forgot, even me, who knows how the building envelopes there have been designed. We forgot that the houses in Florida were not designed for heating. We cranked up the thermostat, and my utility bill was $900. I remember calling the utility company and telling them the decimal point is at the wrong place. And basically, what the Gainesville Regional Utility did, my city at that time, they invested in a public awareness campaign immediately. Like, I had someone in my house within a day doing assessments and giving me recommendations, and with a bill of 900, of course I was listening, and it worked. So I think we building again on the discussion from this morning, that there is evidence that when we have these extreme weather events, that's a good time to get people the information that can help them. Modify your windows, change your windows, replace your windows, invest in a heat pump and that kind of thing. I don't think we're doing enough.
Right. I mean, we will take a question from the floor. My immediate reaction is, goodness me, it's the first time I've ever heard about a benefit of a severe weather event. So, I mean, they're normally terrible. Right. Take a question from the floor. We're just going to get you a microphone, if that's okay. And name and affiliation, please.
So just I apologize I came in late, but just building on your question, I'm curious about consumer education or consumer education more broadly, because yes, I think it's moments of crisis are always opportune, one way or the other, to get information in front of people. But my concern, given your case study and what we understand broadly, is how do you demystify these opportunities to decarbonize, whether it's personal or even on behalf of an institution? How do you actually, what are the best practices or good approaches that enable the individual, regular person, not necessarily an engineer or someone who can really practice, to be able to understand the implications? Is that not the role potentially of academia, to create the models that can be simplified, distilled, and allow customers of all types to be able to determine where they're going to be savings over time for their initial investments, which are substantial to and oftentimes a massive barrier to moving forward with decarbonization.
I would like to take this. Esther, would you like to start?
You can invite Khalid.
Khalid, would you like to start?
I could take that. I mean, look, part of that, look, the educational part has to stay in there, and that has to be standalone effort that continue to work. But I think on the private sector side, the private sector has the responsibility to create kind of easy to decide options. I'll give you an example. In Johnson Controls, at the enterprise level, making that decision, it wasn't easy for companies to say financially this will work or it doesn't work. So we had to come up with a new kind of financial ways. Let's say we call it as a service, meaning selling cooling as a service, where when an average individual at the enterprise level takes a look at it, it becomes a very easy conclusion to say, I will upgrade my equipment because financially it does make sense. So you take a lot of that work outside, but it has to be simple. And now the question becomes, how do you take this to the mass? How do you make it easy for others to look at something and say, I will need, or I can, or I should do it? Because it's even not just educationally and sustainability wise, it's better for the environment, even financially it's easier for me.
Any other reflections?
I can if you like. I was at an event a couple of days ago, actually, where happened to be with the bank Lloyds, and they've just done a survey into kind of consumer thinking around the environment and housing. about such things. Two stats that are stuck in my mind that support what was just said was that 70% of those that they polled felt that it was the problem of government to sort out the environment, not themselves. That was the first statistic that sticks in my mind. The other statistic that sticks in my mind, this was UK statistics. 85% of homeowners in the UK have less than £5,000 of savings. So where's the money come from, even if they actually agree that there's going to be something to do about it? Just thinking as Catalyst was talking about that, how do you reach people? And I actually think, you know, the companies or the places that have got an understanding of the data and have a relationship with the consumer are the energy suppliers, the people that we all buy our energy from. They know how much you're using, they know where you are, they know what your house is, and I don't see there's any reason why they can't be given at least the opportunity, if not the mandate, to actually go, do you know what, you could use a third less or a half less, and here's the package that's been put together, and they could sell it through in that way to reach the consumer, because the infrastructure to reach the consumer is extremely expensive. I mean, can't remember the exact numbers, but something like 20% of the cost of your electrical consumption on that comes through your meter is actually funding the kind of the call centers and other such things that they have in place to chase the money that they're owed or to give advice to people. That is an awful big investment. So why don't we get more out of that investment and use it more creatively? If the packages can be put in place that they could offer that were, you know, third-party accredited, so there was probity in the system, then I think there's the opportunity to do that. It might even be possible to fund some of that out of the savings that are going to come along, which is the panacea that we would always want to do. So I bought PV cells from my last house before the one that I had then. Somebody knocked the door. They said, we're in the area. We could put PV cells on your roof next week if you want. They quoted me a price for it. They said, if we can get more than 5 consumers doing it, we can have 20% off the price. And they did that. They even sorted out a loan with one of the big commercial banks. I filled in the form. The loan was used to actually put the installation together. They did it in 3 days, and over a period of 5 or 6 years, I got that money back through the savings that they put in place. So I think it's mechanisms like that that I think need to get to the right people, provide, you know, to solve this problem. But it's got to be safe. It's got to have the probity that goes with it, and it's got to have, you know, quality advice that, you know, the little old lady in the street doesn't get sold something she doesn't need. You know, we've got to make sure that is happening.
Yeah, I agree that trust is trust is a real issue.
So from a university perspective, I think there's a service that we're not taking advantage of, but I'll use the US again because that's what I'm familiar with. It's the extension service. The extension services in all land-grant universities in the US, the agricultural sector uses it to the maximum. The built environment doesn't use it enough. To my surprise, I actually found things about energy efficiency, green buildings, and renewable energy solar panels on their platform. Yeah, but it wasn't easily identifiable. I did a Google search because I was wondering, does Penn State have any information about energy, you know, green building rating systems? And I found it on their website. And I'm thinking about, you know, recent experience. We've just changed our windows. Where did we get the information from? Social media. And it was very easy. There was a number, I called, the person came to the house. Within 2 days, he did an assessment. He gave us a date in November. He said it's going to be a one-day job. It was a one-day job, done. Yeah. So I think we need to up our game, people in the built environment, and we need to think about how, first of all, to extend our services, like agricultural extension services, and then also just think about where people are getting the information currently. They are getting the information from social media, from women's group, from a church group. Take the information there. Yeah.
Super. Right. I mean, I think trust is a real issue, and I think that some of these issues are really good. Caroline.
Sorry, I was just going to bring in 3 very quick points, if I may, just to do with this general topic of education and awareness, because the question was kind of about, you know, ordinary members of the public and their awareness about these issues and where to find information. But in my experience, it's not just ordinary members of the public who are uninformed or ill-informed. We've struggled with, very senior members of government in terms of just their understanding of the impact of the built environment and climate change in general. So going back to the data you were sharing at the beginning, Sean, the awareness of that in relation to the built environment and what it could mean for a country's NDCs if changes were made. Very, very low awareness. People think about transport, they think about industry, they think about forests needing to be planted, etc., perhaps about agriculture, but very, very little about the built environment. So I would agree with Esther that we as built environment practitioners and people working in this space need to get out there more and just explain to people. I think there's also a lack of awareness amongst the donor organizations that, we find funding projects, major infrastructure and building projects within Africa, so the practical ways in which projects could be delivered differently, even with those incremental changes. And if those were required by the financiers, the people who are giving grants for that infrastructure development that's so needed, if some of those levers could be used in order to make appropriate level of change within even projects that are under construction at the moment, I think that would be very beneficial. And my final quick point is, let's forget the children, because in so many different situations, it's children who end up by teaching their parents how to do things in a better way. And so where we have opportunity to go into schools and go into, talk to kids about climate change, there's no reason why that has to be just about where does your food come from. It could also be about, well, how do you fit out your home? What do you do with your yard area around your house? There could be conversations that kids can then have with their parents, and we start to educate through even the youngest members of our society. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Right, well, one more question from the floor. Yes. Name and affiliation. I do turn it on.
Hi, I'm from Fosters. Question for Caroline and Esther. So I think what we've learned is that we've made a lot of mistakes as the global north in designing cities in the 20th century. And we've learned from those mistakes, and the new cities, as Chris mentioned, Masdar, there's others in the Far East, in the Near East that we're designing now, are designed for pedestrians, designed for micromobility. We've learned from all our mistakes. But then when we look at what's happening in the global south, they're actually replicating what happened in American cities in the last century. They're drawing plots, selling them off individually, laying down the wire and pipes, and then just pouring roads between the plots. So how can we, as the global north, influence what's happening in the global south and bring our new knowledge that we have learned from our own mistakes?
So we'll keep the answers nice and short. We're running out of time. So Esther to start. Oh, Caroline, go first.
It's a challenging one because people aspire to what they see in other places. The grass is always greener on the other side. I mean, I think that's part of human nature, really. And so there is an awful lot of copycat which goes on. And unfortunately, that copying is not necessarily copying the best examples. So I think the context appropriate solutions that give people that quality of living, quality of service provision that they're looking for, but in a contextually appropriate way. So why would I have air conditioning in any sort of building in Nairobi? The climate doesn't require it. It's to do with good building design. So we as built environment practitioners really have to think about the context and be willing to challenge perhaps clients who are asking for certain things, developers, perhaps challenge even the end user of the building through these public awareness campaigns, social media, coming up with really good quality examples so people can aspire to something, not because it looks like New York City or wherever in the developed world, the global north, but because it really is good for the people who are living in that place. Thank you.
Quickly, so I'll just say that I think we also need, building on what Caroline is saying, we need to be telling the true story. That because of the way we live, I don't know my neighbors. I'm embarrassed to say this. I do not think my African peers would want that type of lifestyle They see the Hollywood pictures. They see the nice part of the US. They do not see the reality of what happens, except when COVID happened. And now I could have very honest conversations with my friends because they were telling me, you know, oh, US can struggle. When these extreme weather events happen, they're not happy that it's happening, but it actually humbles us and it humbles them. And they're in a true learning mode. And I think the more we get the true information out, saying, you know, these are the awesome things about the global north, and these are the things which are not awesome, the more we talk about it, the easier it will be for us to transform the way the development is going. And then the final thing I'm going to say, we are grossly underestimating the influence of the diaspora. We are never engaged. We are only looked at as remittances. We do more than send money. We influence things that are happening on the ground. And I think if we are seen as part of the brain circulation, we can actually shift things quite a bit.
Great. Well, I think that's probably all we have time for today. I want to thank our panelists, Caroline, Khalid, Esther and Chris, for a really, really stimulating morning. We've covered a lot of ground. Come back to the very beginning, that, you know, there are significant challenges associated with the built environment and basically the impact that the built environment has on the climate, and hence that's why we're here. But actually there are massive opportunities, and even down to, as Caroline has made it really clear, that we've got some real challenges with regarding communication, okay, let alone just all of the technical innovation and lots of the other wonderful things. But we've got a lot to do in the built environment, and as the built environment practitioners and professionals and educators. But hopefully we can move forward and help make an impact on the climate, which is why we're here at COP28, by doing what's right in the built environment. Thanks ever so much indeed, everybody.
Thank you.